Great, thank you. So let me start by introducing myself and my guests. I'm Padma Warrior. I am the founder of Fable. I started Fable a couple of years ago. I came to the US almost 4 decades ago now as a student, as a graduate student, and my husband and I made our home here in the US. Our son was born here. I worked in the tech industry for almost 3 decades, 30 years, and built many large companies, worked at large companies. I am an American. I was born in India. I grew up there. I am brown. I'm Asian. I founded Fable because I know stories promote empathy, social perception, and emotional intelligence. And as part of our mission at Fable, we share stories for everyone. We bring stories for everyone. And with the idea that reading and listening to stories helps us with our own mental well-being. We've created a special list of books on Fable if you go to our website or our app. That is specifically dedicated to AAPI authors, and we will donate Fable's proceeds from these books to stop AAPI hate. So if you feel up to it, go buy one of those books and we'll donate the proceedings from that to great organizations that are promoting diversity. This is now a perfect time to celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander authors and literature because we can take pride in the diversity that we bring and also take action. And so just to help me celebrate this Heritage Month, I'm thrilled to bring together a couple of authors and, as I mentioned, a book talker who'll inspire all of you, I'm sure, with their great insights. So let me introduce our panelists today. I'll start first with Celine Velez. Celine, say hi. She is she's the creator of a very popular TikTok group called Moongirlreads. She's been featured in the New York Times, and I'm very proud to announce that she just started her book club on Fable today. And within an hour, she has over 100 readers in her book club. She shares her passion of reading with her audience on TikTok, on Bookstagram. She's currently a student at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Yay, she's hopefully going to be doing in-person learning very soon at a beautiful campus. And she influences major publishing houses like Penguin Random House, Macmillan, Wattpad, and Simon & Schuster. So yeah, welcome, Celine. We look forward to hearing your insights. Next, I want to introduce Yang-Sze Choo. Yang-Sze, say hi. She is a best-selling novelist and a fourth-generation Malaysian of Chinese descent. Her first novel, The Ghost Bride, is now a Netflix original series. And her second novel, The Night Tiger, made many Book of the Year lists in 2019. By the way, like me, and she loves to eat and read, and hopefully we'll talk about food also in this conversation today. My third guest is Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. Chitra is a very close friend, and she's an award-winning author, poet, activist, and she wrote 18 books. Many of them you can probably see in her bookshelf at the back there. We were proud to publish her folio on Fable. The folio is titled "The Immigrant Story is an American Story." And her most recent novel, The Last Queen, is based on the life and adventures of Queen Zindan. Great book. She always writes from the perspective of the woman with a very feminist perspective. So I appreciate that. So welcome to all of you. First, I want to start by exploring your journeys, your personal journeys, both as creators, members of the AAPI community, supporters of the community. So Yang-Sze, I want to start with you. You're a fourth generation Malaysian of Chinese descent. How did your identity, your immigration shape your story? And you described yourself as a vivacious reader as a child. How did the books you read as a child help you in your journey?
Well, perhaps voracious is probably a better term, because I really loved to read a lot when I was a kid. I was always felt really worried if I didn't have a book. I wonder whether you felt like that that feeling of, oh no, there's no more library books, and now I'll have to read the back of various packets. So I did actually spend my childhood in a number of different countries, partly because of my father's, actually all because of my father's job. And on reflecting on that, I realized that moving to different settings, often countries where I couldn't speak language initially, really made me much more of an observer. And I think many writers are observers. You actually have to pay attention. So when you're always a new kid at school in a foreign country, you're like, hey, why did everybody get up and go and line up at the other end of the school? I better find out why. So I think it also brings a natural curiosity, like where, when, who did it? And so that's definitely, I think, been part of my personal journey as a writer. And a lot of the things that go into books that I actually often appreciate are the small gestures, the things that tell you that someone was really hesitant about a decision, or they'd planned this from the beginning. So things like that. That's, I think, observation, moving around the different countries, that really played a big part. And when I came to America, I came to study here like you did, Padma. I just was amazed, because America to me was an exotic country, a land that I had seen in movies. So arriving in America, I was just like, oh, wow, look, it's a yellow taxi. I have seen this in a movie, this big American car. And when I first saw that, I was like, wow, it looks like a movie. So, and my friends in university were like, we are not riding in this taxi. This is expensive. Let's go. So a lot of things that I think are part of the American landscape, I think people don't realize have become iconic. So for example, like the first time I saw a diner, I thought about Edward Hopper's like Midnight Diner kind of painting. I was like, this is a diner. It has vinyl seats. Can we go there? So people are like, why? So I think part of that is, the immigrant's journey is also a journey of observation and curiosity and wonder.
Great, thank you. Celine, you were just telling me before we started the webinar that your mom's actually telling you you read too much, right? When did you develop this love for reading? And how did you decide to start talking about books on TikTok and Instagram?
Like Yang-Sze did too. I was always reading as a kid. Even if I was going somewhere in the car to like Target, I would have a book with me, because you never know, I might just need a book. My teacher would have to tell me to stop reading in the middle of class. Like, that's how much I love to read. And as I got into high school, I did get caught up with a few more things: academics, clubs, sports. And so I wasn't able to read at the frequency that I used to before as a kid, but I still loved it. And then when the pandemic hit last year, I had a lot of free time now. I didn't get to have like my prom or my senior night. I didn't get to see my friends. And so all I had were my books, all of the books that I'd accumulated over time. So I just kept rereading them, and everyone had this little app called TikTok. Everyone was just on it. And then I noticed there was this side of TikTok, this whole community that I'd never heard of before, where people were talking about books. And everyone just seemed so happy and so supportive. And I was like, I'd love to make some friends. I don't really have a lot going on right now. I just have all these books. And so that's when I decided to start recommending all of these books. And I noticed that even as I read a lot as a kid, and as much as I loved to read the books that were super popular at the time, I never really saw a female lead or a main character that really looked like me. And so as I was able to connect more with my community, I realized I have a platform now, and I can give these recommendations, these opportunities that I have to discover these books to, other girls who might look like me, who might be a little bit younger. I'm 18 now. I know there's a whole community of young girls out there who are probably looking for books where the main characters look like them. And so that's why I definitely wanted to use the platform that I got to share my book recommendations and all the books that I loved.
Awesome. So grateful that you're doing that and being a role model and using your voice to lend voice to others. I'm so proud of you. Chitra, you like me came to the US to go to graduate school. I think like Yang-Sze too, I think. So what was that experience like? And you travel a lot. I think reading your stories that reflect so many different places. How has all of that influenced your writing and your own journey?
Well, like you, yes, I came here to go to graduate school. And the interesting thing was I had never thought all the years of living in India that I would become a writer. And I really think it was immigration that made me into a writer because like Yang-Sze was saying, it made me observe things the way I never had at home in India because everything there had been familiar and here everything was different and at once either wonderfully amazing or like scarily unusual or somewhere in that spectrum. So I paid a great deal of attention to the world around me. It was like looking at everything from a new eye and I wanted to like record that. So I just started writing things for my own self, really never thinking that I was going to publish. I also realized something else, that as America was taking up more and more of my attention, I was forgetting things about India. And I did not want to do that. So writing for me was a way of, it was an action against that forgetting. So that became very important. And then the immigrant story, which I was living, and which was such a powerful story because immigration can change us if we open ourselves to it. It can change us in some very maybe surprising ways. And I could see that going on in me and in my community around me. So I said, well, I have to write about that as well. So those are the things with which I started writing. That's how immigration affected me. It made me into a writer of immigrant stories, a writer of, Asian American stories, and a writer of a chronicler of change in some ways.
That's so great. It's so wonderful. All of you mentioned the power of observation and how stories actually, whether it's writing or reading stories, sharpen our powers of observation, right? It also, I think sometimes when you read, you have a tendency to like imagine what that is. And when you actually see that, you realize that it's so mundane. For me, like growing up in India, I was reading a lot of books that mentioned, I used to read like YA books when I was younger in India. And, I read this series that always talked about scones and I was fascinated to like eat a scone. The first thing I did when I came to the US was like go to the grocery store, like searching for scones. And I'm like, oh, these are scones? I thought there was some fabulous thing. And it's like, okay, it's kind of dry and it's not that great. But it's just like this, I had this mental image from everything I was reading. So yeah, I think as immigrants, we kind of have all these simple stories and powers of observation that are wonderful. So yeah, now moving to talk about how we let our identity, sometimes our identity influences our work, right? And sometimes our work influences our identity as well. So Yang-Sze, starting with you, how do your ties, I guess maybe do your ties to Malaysia affect how you write and how you think about your stories?
Well, yeah, certainly, I think, because both my books were set in Malaysia. And when I started writing, I thought that that is what I want to write about. Perhaps also when you're away, you're filled with a tremendous like nostalgia and longing for home as well. And even when it's things like, you're talking about food, and I was thinking, just actually talked to my daughter the other day, like they don't really have fried bananas here the way they have them at home. Why isn't there anyone standing by the roadside frying bananas? So, you said small things like that, but very much so. And Chitra, I like what you said about thinking about things that you've missed and also recreating the world to explain things to other people. But when I first started writing, I now actually never thought that I never thought I would be a writer. Like, I also thought I'll never get published, and who's going to read this? Anyway, so I did, but so I wrote a lot about, and I write historical fiction as well. But I think the things that capture your imagination and live on in your dreams, and these are the things I think about. My parents, for example, still in Malaysia, so I call them. And I wonder, like, are you doing okay? The pandemic's been going on for a while, So I think writing is also a way of entering into a dream, or into a story or experience a desire to be somewhere, or a reflection on something else, you know. And to me, it's something that has to be quite rooted. It's hard for me to write about a place that I haven't been to. I think some people can, you know, but for me, at least starting out, I wrote about the things that had captured my heart in childhood, like crumbling old colonial houses and the jungle, which would basically take over most of Southeast Asia if it was allowed to. and all the animals in it, you know. So those are the things I think that captured my imagination.
Great. Celine, were there a couple of books that influenced you as you were when you, I mean, you're still very young. I was going to say when you were younger, but like how much younger could you be? But influenced you in realizing your identity and why did you feel drawn to support a community that was different, or a diverse set of communities?
I have the books in my folio, but the very first book that I read, I was like 15 years old. And this was definitely before I started the TikTok, before I really started anything or had any conversations with people regarding diversity in books. And all the times that I saw Asian characters, typically they were written to fit stereotypes. They were token minorities, or they were like killed off to help a white character's, you know, story arc and everything. And so I had never really seen a book where, you know, the main character was an Asian woman and she didn't die at the end, or she had like a full complete character arc, and it was just focused on her. And the very first book that I read that kind of, I was like, whoa, like she's really cool and she looks like me, was Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Enyon. And I was like 15, I think I said at the time, and I was reading it, and that's still one of my favorite books to this day that I really, really like. And it does have a lot of hype on the book talk community because we all kind of talk about it, but it focuses on not just East Asian mythology, which is who the main character is, but just kind of has this like incorporation of just like beautiful things. And the way she writes Asian culture is like, I'd never really seen this happen before. All the fantasy that I read about was mainly like European and everything. And so it was really nice to kind of just read this. And it was like about these women kind of overthrowing like the patriarchy and this demon king, which if you guys are into fantasy, I definitely recommend checking it out. And it was just a great book. And it was really nice to have that representation.
Did that give you courage as you were reading to develop a platform that's your own? Did you draw inspiration from it, or how did you relate to that?
When I first started out, when I had like a few followers, that was definitely one of the first books that I was recommending, because I didn't really see a lot of people reading it. And I was like, you guys need to read this book. This is not only a great book with just a lot of representation, but she's a strong female character, and everyone just needs to read this book. That's kind of how like my mindset was.
Okay, great. Well, we have some questions coming in the chat, and Chitra, you already talked about how your journey from India to the US influenced your writing. So if you all don't mind, I'm going to go to some of the questions from our audience and intersperse them. I think they're very relevant. You know, we have a comment here from Susan saying, for me, books let me travel and be exposed to cultures when I can't physically do that. How has writing helped you share your culture and the observations of the people in the United States? I'm curious about your views of the way people in different parts of the country treat and perceive people who have immigrated to the United States. So I think it's talking about how has writing helped you share the fact that culture and the power of observation are important, and how are you curious about, and they're curious about your views on different ways people look at immigration and immigrant even within the United States. Chitra, you want to start?
Sure, I'll start with that. Well, one of the things that became really important to me as a writer, my writing became like double-pronged. And part of it was really realizing what was very important in my culture and wanting to share that with readers really all over the world. Because in India as well, because people in India would read these things in a particular way, but also people in the United States and in other countries, because now my books are translated into a number of different languages. But two projects that were really important to me was the retelling of our Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. But I had a special project, which was I was going to retell them from the point of view of one of the major women characters. And as you know, the teller changes the tale. So I wanted to really show how the experience was for women, these epics, these great grand stories of overthrowing kingdoms and killing demons, etc., etc. But there were amazing women characters there. So I wanted to put them center stage. And I have been delighted to find something that I really believed in as a reader myself, which is books can transcend boundaries of culture. Books are very non-threatening. They invite people in. So even people who didn't know about the epics. And of course, there's a whole Indian American community, a whole South Asian American community here that was very interested in that. So it allowed me to do something amazing and wonderful with my culture, which I think was helped by the fact that I was an immigrant because I had distance and I could see things in a way that was different from how I'd been brought up to look at things. I could think for myself. The other thing that I wanted to write about is the state of our community here, which is, of course, a changing community, but especially a number of my books deal with what happened after 9/11 and how that affected our community. Because I think it's really important for art to reflect not only the wonderful moments, the fun moments, the adventures, but also the challenges of being an immigrant community, the nuances, the things that you have to tell your children, which are really difficult when they ask, you know, Mom, why does that person hate me? He doesn't even know me. So these are some of the things that have, and that has been really important for me to address in my books. I would say overall, I have found the United States a wonderful and welcoming place for me as a writer. But I realize that there are always challenges and always there's a job for a writer to do if we're going to increase, if we're going to open the doors even further and let people into our lives and ourselves go into their lives through our books as writers or films as filmmakers, etc.
Great. Yang-Sze, anything to add to that? Oh, I think you're mute.
I was just going to say that was so beautiful, and I think very true. You know, one of the wonderful things about novels is that they do allow you to travel not only through time but through other people. And when I was reading books when I was younger, and even now, it almost feels like when you're very immersed in a book or a story, you feel like you've fallen into another world and you are a 14th century serf, you know, or something. I really, I read very widely, and I read a lot of different, many international and translated authors as well. And I'm also a big fan of Chitra. So. But I think that is very true. And the fact that you can, by living in a book, maybe time travel and to someone else's experience, I think is one of the greatest educational things one can do, you know, because you can read a book about, you know, what it was like in 16th century Poland, but you won't feel the weight of serfdom until you've actually, you know, walked in that person's shoes metaphorically in a novel. So I always, you know, when people ask me, like, what do you tell your children? I always tell them to read widely, read more, read out of your comfort as well, you know, read other cultures that you haven't necessarily seen. I think all of that is true. And it is also not only have books, I think books have given me a whole range of kind of emotion and nuance. Like you read a book and you grieve over it, and you read another book and you feel kind of entranced, you fall in love, you feel like the weight of feuds, you know. So really, I think pretty amazing. There's so many lives in, you know, in like a stack of paper. And Celine, going back to what you said, like bring a book everywhere, I did feel that very much so too. The days before they were ebooks were just terrible days, because I'd actually go to the library and borrow a ton, and then you'd be like, I'm carrying it, this doesn't fit in my bag. but I have to wait at the DMV. You just had to add more. And without that, I think that's also like an escape valve.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it lets you live in someone else's head for a while and also feel those stories more intimately, I think.
Great. Awesome. Thank you for that. So I will come back to, I think you guys kind of partially didn't answer the previous question, but I'll come back to that. But in the meantime, we have a fan of Celine. Hello, my name is Akshara, and I just wanted to say that Celine is a very cool TikToker. We agree with you, and I love watching her videos. Her question is, what are some good YA novels with Asian, South Asian as well, to be more specific, that have that representation, which would be great to read? Actually, Celine has just released a folio on Fable with 3 amazing Asian American authors, right? Do you want to say more about that, Celine?
Yes, definitely. One of the books that I recommended that has specifically the South Asian rep is An Ember in the Ashes by Subha Tahir. And that's a fantasy book if you're into fantasy. And it's just one of the greatest books. I genuinely think it's super, super underrated. And I could see it becoming like a Harry Potter or like Divergent, just like a staple fantasy book because it's so beautiful. Her writing style is amazing. And just the incorporation of these mythological creatures from South Asian fantasy is amazing. Like, definitely check that one out. Yeah. If you're
Great. And by the way, if you want to join Celine and read with her, we have a book club that Celine is personally moderating. And I actually want to join that book club. There are books that are amazing. I know I'm by no means a YA. I'm an A, but I definitely want to read those books with you.
It is for everyone. Come read with us. Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the question you guys kind of didn't answer is, what is your perspective? Do you have a point of view on how immigrants are treated in different parts of the U.S.? Do you feel, I mean, some of you may have lived in different parts of the U.S. Did you feel you were accepted differently or welcomed differently in different parts of the United States? I think that was one of the questions that was previously raised. Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I can say something briefly. I've lived in 3 parts of the United States for any amount of, significant amount of time. And one is Ohio, one is California, and one is Texas right now. But I do think that although, I think public opinion fluctuates depending on what's happening politically in the country. So as I was saying, in the wake of 9/11, there was a lot of prejudice. There were hate crimes against my community. And I wrote about that, and that was important to write about. But I think my overall impression has been, maybe because I most closely am associated with people at universities who are largely open-minded, mostly my experience has been very positive, that people really want to know. And one of the main ways they want to know about cultures is by reading about them. So for me, it has been a very positive overall experience, not to forget the darker moments, the moments of prejudice that happen. I think whenever one is a visible minority, there will be spikes of these hate moments. And of course, recently we have seen a lot of that directed against the AAPI community, which is a reason why I'm really glad you're doing this. Because, whenever I think about this, I'm reminded about what Maya Angelou, a wonderful writer who has influenced me in many ways, says in her biography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. There's a moment where she and her brother are children, and they're talking to their older uncle, and they've just suffered a terrible visit from the Ku Klux Klan. And the children are asking the uncle, why do they hate us so much? And the uncle says, it's because they don't know us. And when I read that and I decided to become a writer, I said, I'm going to do whatever I can to, to kind of break through that ignorance, that at least to make my stories available, not only for people outside the community, which is important, but for people in our community, so they feel seen, they feel, understood, because they too need to be understood.
Yeah, I think that's a great message. Thank you for sharing that. I can share my story. I came to the US as a graduate student, and I lived in many, many different parts of the US, working all along in the tech industry, which was also very male dominated and not very diverse. Still not, is not. I wish it would be more so. I think, definitely where parts of the US where there's maybe a political aura of an anti-immigrant movement or bias against certain races, you certainly feel that as an individual living there in those communities. I've lived in Arizona, I've lived in Illinois, I've lived in New York, I've lived in California now, I've lived in many, many different parts of the US. I always, though, felt that the immediate community, my neighbors, people I go to the grocery store with, people I leave my son with to watch him, I never felt like they saw me as anything different. So I think there is this micro community of humanity and human beings, and we support each other, help each other. I never felt they saw me as Asian, as brown, or as an Indian immigrant or anything like that in any of the communities I've lived in within the US. But at a macro level, we definitely feel that. And I think we all have the responsibility to lend a platform, like Celine is doing, lend a voice, like all of you are doing in your writings, in our stories, to make sure we address that. So hopefully that helps answer the question. So I want to keep moving. There's lots of great questions. There's a couple of questions posted here. This one I will address to all of you. As women, was there a moment that made you realize you had to speak up for yourself? So maybe I'll start with you, Celine.
Just in like a general sense of just having to speak up. I went to an all-girls private high school, and just a lot of the time, I'm not really used to going into classes with men or just boys or everything. I was very used to just, being with all my girls and just having that kind of supportive community. And whenever I'm in, like, we had like discussions with our like brother school, we would come and we would like meet up and everything. And it's just, there's just something about teenage boys where they think they own the world. And it's like, there's just something I've noticed, and I'm like, you guys.
At all age, at any age.
Oh yeah, totally. And it's just, there's something in high school, and my brother's school is, they're very good at athletics. They were very good at athletics, super, just very, very big egos too. And so it was just kind of me just being able to keep myself grounded and just having to do that whenever I come into discussions with them. And so that was just kind of like my high school experience. And I'm just not a type of person who, if a guy is telling me to just kind of, I just like I'm not really used to that. And that's how I always try to recommend books on my channel with women who are strong leads, who are strong in different ways. Maybe they're not always outspoken, but they don't take anything, and they always stay strong in their opinion and themselves. So that hopefully maybe there's some people out there who are looking to understand that, or to read maybe from a woman's perspective. They're a guy, they're trying to understand how women feel. And that's kind of how we're going back to books. They just give you that chance to experience a person's life where you'll never be able to really experience, to understand how they're feeling. And so that's why I always try to focus on books with strong, typically women of color leads.
That's great. Yang-Sze, do you have anything to add about was there a moment in your life, in your writing, in your career, that you realized that you need to speak up as a woman?
Oh, so many. I was like thinking, where does one start? I think it starts, as Celine says, I think it starts in school. I noticed that in school, that after a certain time, the girls stop asking questions and the boys ask questions. And I don't know whether this is cultural or whatever, but it seems true, because I've gone to school in a number of different countries. It's the same everywhere, and I've also noticed that girls tend to want to make sure that they know what they're saying, like they won't, and this continues on to working life, in which when there are meetings, women will be like, I'm going to make sure that I know what I'm saying before I open my mouth. Mm-hmm. And a lot of guys are like, I don't know anything about this, but let me tell you, like, this, and I also remember this in high school, thinking like, hey, I did all the reading, And I know that guy didn't read the book because we were talking about it outside the classroom. He told me, I didn't do any of this reading. And he's talking. And so I realized that yes, you do have to speak up because, but part of the speaking up also to me seems also part of American culture. Like coming to university in America, I realized everybody talks a lot more. And in Asia, people are like, okay, there'll be this pause because we're all very politely waiting to see what someone wants to do. That's partly cultural as well. But I realized you've got to talk and you have to express how you feel. And actually, when I was a very little girl, when I first heard about arranged marriages, when I was listening to my grandmother, my aunties talk about like, do you remember what happened in blah, blah, blah? And I was like, what happened? They're like, well, girls used to get married off very young, or they would be married off as daughters-in-law, or if your family was too poor, they might actually, and this happened to some of my relatives, if you cannot raise your daughter, you might actually send her off as what they call in Cantonese, sampo zai, like a daughter-in-law. A 6 or 8 year old girl would be sent to live in another family where she would be raised basically as an unpaid servant. And then when she grew older, she just had to marry one of their sons. And I remember hearing about this when I was a kid and then asked my mom, are they still doing this? And she's like, no, they're not. But I felt like, I don't ever want to do this. So, that's another area I think that women need to speak up. And it's not always easy,
Mm-hmm. Great. Chitra, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think like some of us are saying here, I was born and brought up in a very traditional Indian family. And I was definitely taught that women should not make waves. And plus there was the cultural thing, the larger cultural thing of being quiet in school. So when I first came here, I was very quiet at the university and professors would be like, why don't you ever speak up? And, I'd have to explain to my advisor and things like that. I think what really got me out of that is when I started doing activist work in my community, in the Asian American community, in the field of domestic violence. I started that when I was doing my PhD at Berkeley. I started working in the Women's Center, and just that phenomenon of women being subjected to violence just had such a huge impact on me that I felt I needed to speak out about that. So I think that was one of the places where I started speaking out. And then I went on to be co-founder of a South Asian American organization, Maitri, which is now a wonderful organization, much larger now and really impacting a lot of lives very positively. But I remember when we started that, there was a lot of outcry in the community because they felt that we were exposing skeletons, we were opening cans of worms, we were creating problems where there weren't problems. And we were like, listen, nobody creates a domestic violence problem. It's there, and that's why you need to address it. We need to speak out about it. And I started writing about it. So in novels like my first novel, The Mistress of Spices, my first collection of stories, Arranged Marriage, there are women in these situations. And often when I worked with women in these situations, because they're so complex, we don't see the quick results that we as activists would love to see. And I completely understand how one has to, break out of really difficult situations. But in my novels and my stories, I had those things happen. I had women breaking out. I had women being successful. I had women speaking up and demanding the dignity that should have been theirs. And my hope is that, not only was that cathartic for me, but perhaps for my readers as well, it will provide some amount of inspiration.
Such a wonderful topic to be supportive of. And it's so horrific, actually, sometimes when you read about these cases of domestic violence. Typically women stay silent and put up with it for so long. So
yes, I just wanted to say that domestic violence extends across the communities in the United States. So one shouldn't think of it as an Asian American problem, but it is also there in our Asian American community. So neither should we try to deny it and pretend that it doesn't exist. And that's the balance that we have to try to carefully maintain.
Yeah, I think some of these issues are prevalent regardless of which society. And I think sometimes in some cultures, we are taught not to bring these to light. And we're taught, maybe we are taught subconsciously to sugarcoat issues, and we can't. And I think when we see something being done wrong, we need to speak up. And so that's what I heard from each of you. So thanks for sharing. Now for a fun question, again from our audience. When you're taking a break from reading and writing, what's a comfort food you enjoy? Come on.
Okay, I'll go first. I'll tell you my absolute guilty pleasure. I love pizza and ice cream. Those are my absolute two guilty pleasures. I try to make them a little less guilty, especially through COVID, because we have been trying to stay away from restaurants. So I have now learned to make really good pizza with lots of veggies and, special cheeses. And it's been a fun thing to do. And yeah, my family really likes it. They like it better than when I write lots and lots, because then it's no fun for them.
Great. Yang-Sze, I know you love food. We've talked about this.
I do. I was actually thinking what to say. So many things. Things that I love. I mean, always chocolate, which can be eaten at, can be kept in a pocket and eaten surreptitiously at all hours of the day, including like under the bed. My husband's like, "What are you doing?" It's like, "I'm just picking something up." So, a lot of chocolate, but I love bread as well. And I'm getting older and I can't have as much bread as I used to. And the other day I was looking on the internet and I said, look, there's something called the carb diet. I want to be on this. And they're like, no, it's actually the low carb diet. Completely wrong. But there really is something very comforting about bread, like this pillowy, yeasty bread that I just want to eat lots and lots of bread, as well as cake and fried chicken. That's also sorry, I have to stop myself because I'm going to start listing. Yeah. I feel the other guilty pleasure is instant noodles, and I know they are so bad for you, but it's like you're up at midnight and you shouldn't be up at midnight, and you're very hungry, and then you make yourself some instant noodles, and eventually someone else in the family be like, "I smell something. What are you cooking?" So that's another guilty. I'll stop here because
all right. Celine?
I am blessed to live in Southern California, where an In-N-Out is always within a 5-mile radius. So every single time I finish a book or I want to take a break, I'm always like, I did something productive today. Let me go reward myself. And I'll go to In-N-Out, and I have my In-N-Out order perfected: a double single, no spread, no onion, extra toasted bun, French fries, and a lemon up, which is lemonade and Sprite. But it is my favorite comfort food right now. And I know maybe eating In-N-Out all the time during a pandemic when the gyms aren't open probably wasn't the best idea, but it is definitely one of my favorite comfort foods. And I'm so happy that I can always just go in my car and grab some In-N-Out.
Yeah, my favorite comfort food is dumplings. I can eat if I can, I can order dumplings, and if I have them, I think like your noodles, it's sort of like I can keep eating them and not stop. Sort of like, yeah, it's interesting. Great. Okay, so we're almost at the end of our session. Thank you for all those questions. Please keep the questions coming. Let me maybe get back on track to the questions I had wanted to ask. Celine, I'll start with you. You mentioned in one of your TikToks that you spent the majority of your high school career helping survivors. You also worked with helping survivors of domestic violence and sex trafficking. Were there any books that you found that would help these victims?
So in high school, we always had to do something that we called Christian service, where we would volunteer and get some hours for helping in our community. And a lot of people would just like go to preschools to help out and like volunteer, do some paperwork. But there was just something where I noticed that in my community, there were a lot of domestic violence shelters or sex trafficking shelters. And I was just at this point in my life where I really, really wanted to just help women in any way that I could. So I started this organization at my school. And instead of making it like a foundation that would kind of leave after I graduated, I made it this kind of organization where we would fundraise directly for the organizations in our community, then donate all of those funds to them, or we would make these little packages called care baskets, I'd like to call them, where I'd communicate with the shelters, figure out kind of what items they needed, and then I'd write like handwritten letters. I would spend like hours just writing letters to whoever would receive the basket. And I never communicated directly with any of the survivors in the shelters because I really respected their privacy. And that was just one of the biggest things that I would always talk to the workers about. And I was also able to do a lot of training to kind of learn about the cycles of domestic violence and how domestic violence is just a really hard thing to break out of for a lot of women. And sometimes when they do, they just feel this like sense of, oh, who am I like right now? Like and they just like need to feel that like empowerment and reminder that you're a woman, you're strong and you're treasured and you're beautiful. And I think the best book that I think every woman should read is Circe by Madeline Miller. And it's just such an incredible, amazing read. And I think that's definitely a book for any woman at any point in their life to read, especially if they're going back to try and like recenter themselves and just kind of figure out who they are again as a woman. I just love that book so much.
Yeah, I love that book. I've read it twice actually, and we just finished reading it. I have a book club on Fable that's open to anyone to join called Fierce Females Book Club. And that was the first book we read. We are reading now an Asian American author called Sean Juliana Wang, her book called Home Remedies. That's the current one I'm reading. And I'm going to read Chitra's books and Yang-She's books next, I think. So they're in my queue. But Circe is an amazing book because it's told from the perspective of a witch, right? And in mythology and how she becomes this powerful woman. So that's great. And thank you for all the work that you started doing in high school. That's wonderful to hear. So this next question is another fun question. Again, this will be the last set of questions for each of our panelists. So this one is for you, Chitra. This question's for Miss Divakaruni. I read Victory Song when I was very little, and since then I have been wondering if Neela and Samir got married in the future. Did they?
Well, that's a great question. And it's talking about one of my books for young adults, a Victory Song, which is set around India's independence struggle. And the main characters are two young people who are like in their early teens at that point. And I wanted to write that book because I wanted everyone all over the world to know that children had taken part in our independence struggle, that because they could go where adults couldn't go, they were often very, very important as messengers and spies. So this book is built around these two young people and how they aid the independence struggle. And yes, towards the end, they are falling in love. You know, they're just getting to that teenage age where they're falling in love. And yes, I think in my mind, in my heart, I do see them being together in an independent India. I think that would be the way I would see that story ending. But thank you. I am so glad that you enjoyed that story because I really wanted young people to learn about, you know, these very amazing, inspiring young people who really played such an important part in the independence struggle. And many of them died for that. And they're not even known. So thank you. I'm happy to hear that.
I love happy endings, so I'm happy they got married.
Well, at the end of the book, it's better than marriage because they've just fallen in love.
I see.
Like rainbows. Yes.
Even better. Yang-Sze, last question for you. And after that, I'm afraid we have to stop. So there's a lot of conversation happening, and I appreciate that. So you write a lot about colonialism in your stories, or the setting is there. Do you feel when you write about that informs your readers about the historical perspective as well, in addition to the fictional part?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And by the way, I'm just having so much fun listening to all of you talk. This is so fun. I want to ask Chitra, like, the part that's rainbows is better than marriage. But anyway, going back to colonialism.
You're right. Maybe oops, that was not a very politically correct statement.
No, I think that's true, because that's the part that we often write about in books. You know, that's the front part, and then there's the back part, and the whole thing. It makes a whole. You know, so I think that's really fun. But going back to colonialism, I think colonialism has had a very long shadow, you know, and influences things in many ways which are not always so clear. I mean, there's the obvious part of it. And in Night Tiger, which is my novel, which is set in 1930s colonial Malaya, I actually was inspired to write it because when I was a child, there were not that many English language books about Malaysia. And there was Somerset Maugham, and there were piles of Somerset Maugham novels lying around at home. So I read them, and I didn't really understand them. You know, I read them from the point of view of a child, in which I felt like he's talking about relationships between men and women, and a lot of secrets of people who had maybe left the UK to come to the colonies for some reason of their own, sometimes running away from things, you know, sometimes looking to find other things. And in many of them, I actually thought, I think that these servants would have understood what was going on. So it's like going back to the gaze, like whose gaze are we looking at this novel from? And so when I wrote Night Tiger, one of the characters is an 11-year-old Chinese houseboy at a time in history when your houseboy could literally be a child, as Chitra said. You know, their children were there, they were doing a lot of things. Sometimes they were working, and they were not always noticed by people. And so I thought that was a very interesting way to look at some of the things that were going on at that time, seen through the eyes of also this sort of upstairs, downstairs thing that I think we all enjoy too. This sort of I'm sure the servants knew who was having an affair with who. They must have known. They opened the door, you know. So I think that there's just so much to explore there. And like I said, it has a long shadow and many nuances.
Great. There's a comment here for you, Yang-Sze, to Miss Choo. I want to thank you so much for Leland's character in The Ghost Bride. I would have been so frightened dealing with a ghost haunting, but Leland was so brave. So thank you for that character. So on that note, I want to thank all of you for joining me today. What a wonderful conversation. We can keep going. There's just so much to talk about and so much brilliance from each of you. Key takeaways for me from this conversation, as women, as Asian Americans, and part of the AAPI community, we do need to speak up. We need to find a moment or several moments that we find the strength, whether it's from our own experience or other people's experience, to speak up against things that we are seeing, you know, whether it's domestic violence or whether it's treating people differently. I think that's really important. Each of you have talked about how books really influenced your thinking, whether it's taking you to another time zone or bringing other time zones into the present. Books have this amazing way to let us travel, let us put ourselves in other people's shoes. So thank you for both of you who are writing these great books, and for me, for people like me and Celine to read a lot, and our audience to read a lot. That was the second takeaway. Each of you, Celine, Chitra, have personally been involved in fighting and supporting organizations that are fighting domestic violence against women. We're very grateful for that. And thank you for the support that you're bringing to the society. We also talked about food. We love to eat when we think no one's looking. They tended to be quite carb heavy, but they are always weaknesses that we enjoy, and we're all human. I think that's what that tells me. So I appreciate all of you joining us. We will have this conversation available and make it available for those people that could not join us today. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.